I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from the front lines, analyse the impact of drone strikes on Russia, and ask why the British Foreign Secretary is heading to China.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 30th of August, 1 year and 187 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dom Nichols, assistant comment editor Francis Durnley, and Russia correspondent Natalia Vasilyeva. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. Let's start inside Russia and also in Crimea. So in what we think is the biggest Ukrainian drone attack since the war started, certainly in terms of geographic scope and impact, 6 regions of Russia and Crimea, Russian positions in occupied Crimea, were hit last night. So first, we think quite a sizable wave of a drone strike hit the Russian military airbase in Pskov region. So we're about 20 k's from the border with Estonia, right up in the northwest of Russia here. A number of military aircraft were set ablaze. Russian officials said 4 Il-76, Ilyushin-76 military transport planes were damaged in the attack. These are the big 4-engine strategic logistic airlift, the big old things. Quite old, but still good and work and are big. They were damaged. That was according to Russian officials. And then further reports on social media from a number of trusted sources say that a Tupolev-22, which is the long-range strategic bomber, the kind of thing that had been firing a lot of the Kinzhal hypersonic missiles and other cruise missiles, what have you, into Ukraine, one of those was damaged as well. So TASS, the Russian news agency, quoting emergency services, said 2 of the Il-76 planes had burst into flames. And aside from that, so that strike, Russian officials also reported other drone attacks across a number of regions. So let's just picture a clock face, put Moscow in the middle and draw a line down to the 6 o'clock and out to the 8 o'clock. So that little lozenge there, that's where all these drone strikes happened. So in the Bryansk region, that's right down in the southwest of the country. That's about 150 k's inside Russia from the point where Russia, Belarus and Ukraine meet. So that's Bryansk. That's the city, but that's the region down there. That was hit. So was the region of Oryol, which is just to the east of Bryansk. Then go slightly north, getting closer to the centre of the clock face, if you like. Kaluga region, that was hit. That's between Bryansk and Moscow. Moscow region was hit itself, although we don't think the city was. And then Ryazan, which is to the southeast of Moscow. So that entire lozenge to the southwest and south of Moscow, and including Moscow, was hit by drones overnight. No casualties reported there. And then in Crimea, Sevastopol harbour was reportedly hit by naval drones, although I couldn't find any other information to back that up. Now, in a briefing today to journalists, Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, she said that the drones, particularly the ones that hit the Pskov airbase, she said could not have covered such distances without information from Western countries. I know, maybe she means Google Maps. But I mean, that's what I used Google Maps this morning. Saw very nice pictures of some Il-76s sat on the pan at Pskov. So you don't need that much help from Western countries to find the bloody place, Mrs. Zakharova. Pesky Google Maps. Anyway, meanwhile, Russia also launched massive air attacks of its own overnight last night, killed 2 people in Kyiv. Ukrainian officials have described it as the most powerful wave of attacks to hit the city since spring. So over 40 missiles and drones, we're not sure the exact mix, targeted the city. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko it said all but one drone was reportedly intercepted. Damage and casualties were caused by the falling debris and the weapon parts when the thing comes out of the sky, obviously. Serhiy Popko, who's the head of Kyiv's military administration, said on Telegram, Kyiv has not experienced such a powerful attack since spring. The enemy launched a massive combined attack using drones and missiles. And General Zaluzhny, who's Ukraine's commander-in-chief, the head of the armed forces, he said Ukraine air defences shot down so he did put a number on it, all 28 Russian missiles and 15 out of 16 drones launched in the attack. Also hit was Zhytomyr, which is about 100 k's west of Kyiv. There was buildings and railway tracks hit there, and Ukrainian officials said some trains were delayed, which I think is just, that kind of says it all, really. Now, separately around the battle space, so US-based think tank Institute for the Study of War, they said that geolocated footage published yesterday shows Ukrainian forces have advanced south of Bakhmut. Ukraine's general staff say Russia seemed to be holding that push there by artillery and airstrikes mostly. There's no indication of any ground forces attempting to push back the Ukrainian advances. And Ukraine are also, again, this is per the ISW, pushing about 5 km southeast of Robotyne. That's in western Zaporizhia Oblast. That's the lozenge. That's the push that's having the most success of the sort of two pushes down south and the effort through Bakhmut. It's that one in the west, Robotyne, that seems to be the most successful and still ongoing. And I think that it's difficult to knit these things together. But I think what's happening there is the point about minefields and these huge defences that Russia seems to have or has down there, and we think they're through the first line. Ukraine is through the first line of what we think is 3 main lines of defence. The point is that these are all defeatable. Mines are defeatable. But you just need time to do it. You need time to concentrate on the device itself. You need time to think about how you're going to push through the lines. And if you've got people shooting at you and loads of artillery raining down, you haven't got a lot of time. So I think what Ukraine have been doing over the last few weeks of targeting the long-range precision strikes on ammunition dumps and logistic nodes and what have you, that is now having an effect because there is not enough artillery fire coming down to stop that push down through Robotyne, to squeeze the flanks. There is, as you can imagine, a lozenge, so the flanks are under extreme pressure, but Russia don't seem to be able to muster enough combat power to close that salient and kill everyone inside it. So it's just interesting when we look at these comments that the counteroffensive isn't going very well. I think it's all knitting together. They changed their tactics a few weeks ago, concentrated on these long-range strikes, and I think that is now having an effect directly on the ground at the front line. But hey, we will see more, obviously, as time moves on. And just finally, a Russian military blogger, one of the channels that we do think speaks not altogether nonsense, he suggested that Russian forces are continuing to commit a significant number of reserves, particularly the airborne elements, the VDV, Russian VDV, into the area of Robotyne, indicating Russian forces are worried about the vulnerability there. And this might be why we're seeing so few ground operations elsewhere, particularly around, as I say, around Bakhmut. But also, if you think about the northeast, Russia had been having some tactical success in the northeast, not making a big breakthrough, but were advancing slowly in some areas. But we've not heard about that for at least a week now. I think any real advance up there, which might mean that either Ukraine's holding the line there, well, they clearly are holding the line, but might be because Russia's redirecting forces because they don't seem to have much of an operational reserve, as in uncommitted troops. So if you want to stop an enemy breakthrough somewhere, you need to take, if you're in that situation, you need to take troops from elsewhere. And maybe they're taking them from the line in the northeast around Bakhmut, hence relying on airstrikes and artillery around Bakhmut rather than ground forces to try and to stall this advance from Ukraine down in the south.
Thanks very much, Dom. Francis, can I come to you? There's quite a few political and diplomatic stories for you to pick up on today. Where would you like to start?
Well, thanks, David. There certainly are. Today marks a significant diplomatic moment for the UK, a visit by Britain's Foreign Secretary James Cleverly to China, an event which is drawing considerable commentary here this morning and which I lead on due to the broader issues it highlights in terms of China's role in world affairs and different approaches debated within the West for dealing with a country whose power in the world has exponentially grown in recent years. However, much like the country, it's a big subject, so I will address that later and cover other bits and pieces of news first. Starting with Germany. So yesterday, Germany arrested a dual national for selling to Russia electronic components that are used in military gear, including drones currently deployed by Moscow's troops in Ukraine. The arrest came just days after the arrest of another suspect for selling military components to Russia. Federal prosecutors said that the man arrested, Valdemar W., exported components on 26 occasions from January 2020 to March 2023 to a company in Russia that makes military equipment. The objects supplied through the suspect's company in Western Germany are common components of the Orlan 10 drone, prosecutors said, and to circumnavigate sanctions, the suspect first imported the goods to Germany before transferring them to two civilian dummy companies based in Russia. Now, the Russian companies then ensured that the components were sent on to the military gear manufacturer. I mention this story for two reasons. One, to highlight how desperate Russia is to acquire these components thanks to certain sanctions and the methods they're using to try and counteract them. And two, because it is yet further evidence of the charge one finds being stated increasingly regarding Germany, that it has been considered a soft target by Moscow and is thereby one of the core targets of its espionage activities. Now, in other news, Russian pro-war nationalist Igor Girkin was seen in court yesterday afternoon, failing in an appeal against his pre-trial detention. He's facing charges of inciting extremism after fiercely criticising the way that Russia has carried out its war in Ukraine, something, of course, we've covered extensively on the podcast. The pro-war blogger fought in the 2014 Ukraine invasion and was also convicted by a Dutch court over the shooting down of the Malaysian passenger plane famously that took place in Ukraine in 2014 with a loss of 298 lives. But all of this, as I say, is further evidence that Russia is clamping down on possible dissent from nationalist figures. We understand that Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin was buried in a private funeral in St. Petersburg yesterday, as we thought likely. Apparently, it was held in a closed format and was open to very few people, hence why there were those question marks that were posed yesterday as to whether he really was being buried. But apparently he was, and that's it, the end, full stop to him, a man, of course, who we've been covering on the podcast for so many months, and a very ignominious end, I think it's fair to say. One other story that's literally breaking. I spoke yesterday about the fallout from the Pope's remarks last week. And as a consequence of said remarks, which I'll detail again in a moment, Lithuania has summoned the Vatican's top diplomat in the country after the Pope had told Russian youth to remember that they are the heirs of the great Russian Empire. So in response to these impromptu remarks, Pope Francis made on Friday in a live video address to Catholic youth gathered in St. Petersburg, the Lithuanian Foreign Affairs Ministry invited the representative of the Vatican to come for a talk. Rather menacing way of putting it, after the Archbishop returns from his holiday. I can imagine that's going to be not too much fun for him. But as I say, I mentioned this story just because the fallout is clearly continuing here. I think the reason it's related to, or particularly why Lithuania is unhappy about this, is that the territories of Lithuania and Poland were annexed into the Russian Empire in the 18th century by Catherine the Great. The countries then broke away after the First World War, after two 19th century revolts against the empire were brutally suppressed. So these kind of remarks of references to a great Russian empire do not go down well there. And as I said yesterday, certainly did not go down well in Ukraine. As I say, the Vatican were keen to try and dispel any damage that has been done diplomatically. And they've said that Pope Francis' intent was to preserve and promote all that is positive in the great Russian cultural and spiritual heritage. But as I say, the timing of that has not gone down well at all. Lastly, back to Russia, a former Russian general has called for a tactical nuclear strike in southern Ukraine after Kyiv's forces are said to have gained a foothold in Moscow's weakest defences, something we covered yesterday and which Dom has just spoken about. This is a pro-Kremlin MP, Gurilev. He's 55, retired lieutenant general. He's urged Russian military leaders to target the Zaporizhzhia region, recently recaptured by Kyiv. He said that the village of Robotyne is an ideal place for the use of tactical nuclear weapons. They have all gathered there in one place. It's just perfect. A small story, and obviously a pretty ridiculous one, frankly, but it does speak to the kind of rhetoric that the Kremlin continues to resort to in the face of Ukrainian military successes. They play the nuclear card. And until that card is well and truly defenestrated, it will continue to rear its head, and I still believe is likely to play a core role before this war ends. And it's been a while since we've talked about it, so I thought I would raise it here, albeit on the back of what is really an off-the-cuff remark by somebody who is very much in the background of this war, so I don't want to give it too much attention. But as I say, it's just yet another example of what the Kremlin will do. It will encourage MPs to say these kind of things because they know that it riles up the West and gets certain countries rather anxious.
Thank you very much, Francis. Well, let's go to our Russia correspondent, Natalia Vasilieva. Natalia, you wrote up the story for The Telegraph yesterday of Yevgeny Prigozhin's funeral. As Francis mentioned, it was rather peculiar. Quite a lot of things happened which you might not expect to happen at a funeral for a hero of Russia. What did you make of what you saw?
Yes, absolutely. That was both surprising and unsurprising in ways that would be quite obvious for someone who have followed Prigozhin for quite a number of years, like myself. So that day for me and other correspondents started with going on social media and seeing reports that at least at 3 cemeteries in St. Petersburg, we saw a heightened security presence. There were police cordons, roads would have been blocked. And it was hours and hours after that we saw an official statement on the Telegram page for Prigozhin's press service that said literally half an hour before the cemeteries were supposed to close that he was laid to rest at another cemetery. Again, quite a peculiar situation, but not for someone who have followed Prigozhin for a long time. Way before the war started, he was known locally as someone who liked a good practical joke. I remember just a couple of years ago, he staged a photo op to pretend that he was meeting Alexei Navalny when he went to St. Petersburg, sort of in an attempt to both troll him and discredit him, to make it look as if he was meeting someone as notorious as that. And sometime also before the war, he reportedly sent a man with identical personal data with his namesake to Lithuania, just after he was sanctioned by Lithuania, for the guy to purely pose for pictures in Lithuania and to be able to show that someone with his name could still travel. So he was known for those practical jokes. And to me, it was not surprising that everyone was running around town waiting for the burial to happen somewhere else before he was buried at a completely different place. Again, you could see that maybe that was his wishes, but also you could also see that this is something what the Kremlin would want. And again, like we know Vladimir Putin as someone who at least liked to declare his adherence to the law. He often likes to reiterate that he's a trained lawyer and that law is very important to him. So if he really did care about the law, you might also argue that Prigozhin, whatever he did beforehand, was entitled to a state funeral because he was awarded the Hero of Russia medal, which is one of the top military decorations, which entitles you to a state funeral. You're supposed to have an honorary guard, maybe 1 or 2 cannons, sort of bidding its last farewell to you. But that ceremony was completely scrapped. Putin was not to be seen. His spokesman said earlier he was not going to be there. And overall, that was a very low-key funeral, which I guess is something that Kremlin would have wanted. I think it's also quite noteworthy that the funeral was not covered by Russian state media at all. Some of the top state media, state channels did not mention the funeral at all. Others just literally showed a couple of seconds of archive footage of the funeral of Prigozhin's, one of his closest allies, who was laid to rest elsewhere on the same day. So we definitely see that the Kremlin wants Prigozhin and Wagner to be forgotten as soon as is possible.
And Natalia, do you think that will happen? Is this the full stop? Is this the end of the ultimate end of Yevgeny Prigozhin and his unsuccessful rebellion? Or will the repercussions from what he did several months ago continue throughout Russia? What do you make of that?
I think there are 2 possible answers to that question. First is the shortest and simple answer: yes, he will be forgotten. I mean, his press office published that note saying that he was buried at this cemetery yesterday evening. And all day today, anyone could just go and lay flowers, stage a picket if they wanted. But what we saw this morning, we just saw individual mourners. There were no crowds. There was no attempt for someone to picket it, to turn into a political event. So I would say whoever says that Prigozhin was popular or like he had the political potential, we just don't see it, because obviously anyone was free to go. This is not something that would be considered dangerous. So we didn't see any of the public adoration that anyone might have expected. But second, I do think that Prigozhin's mutiny did bring to surface the resentment and the disappointment from Russian public with what's going on in the country in general, which did not manifest in any active support, in any actions on the state of Russian society, but it manifested in the complete apathy and paralysis, what we saw when the mutiny happened. Because again, we didn't see any rallies in support of the mutiny, but we haven't seen a single attempt to stop the mutineers. We haven't seen a single military unit. We haven't seen a single band of civilians trying to stop Wagner troops marching on Moscow. So the mutiny did show the cracks in Russian society. It did show how apathetic Russians are to what's going on, how they, at the very worst, they don't care about what's going on in Ukraine in the front line. And that is a fact, and it's not going to go away, whatever happens to Prigozhin or Wagner.
Thanks so much, Natalia. Let's move to your fascinating piece on the impact of the drone attacks on Moscow in particular. You've been speaking to ordinary Russians and just trying to gauge their reactions to the drones flying overhead and exploding and hitting buildings in Moscow. One thing you wrote, which I thought was incredibly interesting, was that, I'm just going to quote from your piece, there appeared to be no ill will toward Ukraine for sending its drones to the Russian capital. Ukrainian officials have claimed that strikes deep inside Russia are intended to wake its people up to the reality of war. But survivors of the drone strikes doubt the attacks will change the minds of Russians, especially those who back the invasion. Could you tell us about the people you spoke to and what they told you?
Yes, sure. I mean, first off, I started working on that story for the plane crash that killed Yevgeny Prigozhin. But I do believe that the story still stands as we see drone attacks continue. And obviously, it's a different thing when a drone hits a military airfield like it did in Pskov this morning. Obviously, the pictures were very dramatic. There's massive damage. But I mean, it is a military target. And of course, psychologically, it's very different when a drone hits a residential building in a well-off area in Moscow. I remember when the first drone attacks in Moscow were reported, it was back in May. There was shock, there was a lot of fear on the ground. And as I tried to revisit it now, I could see that the mood has significantly changed. Again, like for me, it takes an extra effort because I'm not in Russia anymore, so I cannot speak from my own first-hand experience. So I had to go to people and see what it's like. First off, which I really wanted to say, there was no room to speak about it in the story. But what really struck me was the fact that when I started working on that story, I had an idea of who I might be able to find, who would be a good person to find. And I originally thought that it would be very hard to find witnesses of the attacks. I mean, obviously, there would be Muscovites who could speak to what's impact it has on them, but it would probably be difficult to find someone who actually saw it. But it actually turned out to be very easy. I literally found three witnesses in the space of an hour and a half, when I merely contacted my contacts in Moscow, asking them if they happen to know anyone who might have come into contact with those attacks. And they all had someone in mind, and they all immediately said, oh, my sister lives in that building that hit, or I have a friend who is back in Moscow and he can't sleep because of the drone attack. So I myself was surprised to discover of what a mundane thing it has become. And there's one of the people told me that it looks like everyone in Moscow by now has heard that sound. For example, I spoke to one woman who lives in Komsomolsky Prospect. It's a very nice neighborhood just southwest of the city center. And she told me that not only did she hear the drone that crashed just across the road in May, but also she sometimes can hear the drone strikes in Moscow City, in the business district, something like 5 kilometers away. So that really became part of a landscape, and I found it very stunning. But yeah, I was also curious to see what impact those attacks produce. Because again, Ukraine has been coy about claiming responsibility for those attacks. I mean, by now, yes, they have admitted that they were behind attacks on the Crimean Bridge, something like that. But again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they have claimed responsibility for a single Moscow attack yet. So what I heard from people is that whatever effects Ukraine is trying to achieve, it's not working this way. On the one hand, what I heard, it doesn't produce any specific hatred towards Ukrainians, which to me is easy to understand, because if you look at the geography of the drone strikes in Moscow, most of them actually hit very much opposition-minded, liberal, well-off neighborhoods, which have voted for the opposition for a long time, which would be anti-war as it is. These would be the people who would be protesting when it was relatively safe to protest. These are the people who are still anti-war. It's not likely that their opinion would change, and this is what I heard from people. But I also heard other opinions saying that if someone was pro-war, or if someone was hesitant and just didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to think about it, it was definitely unlikely to change their mind and like look around and think, oh, what is happening to us? They would be more likely to jump to the conclusion that, hey, by the way, we're being attacked. And all of those months when the government was telling us this war is about defending you or defending Russia, maybe they were right. That would be the conclusion that some people might jump to. But again, I was very lucky to speak to this woman who both saw a drone strike outside her house, and she also happens to be a psychotherapist who sees clients in Moscow, and she was able to talk about the mood and what people are struggling with. And apparently quite a lot of her clients are basically in denial, are trying to shut themselves out from reality, and they just don't want to talk about it, because obviously if you keep worrying about it, you're just going to go crazy, as some people have told me.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Dom, I know you had some thoughts on this. Do you want to jump in now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that. And hi, Natalia. Great to speak again. Well, a couple of things, really. I've just been chatting here in the studio with the F-bomb, and he made a very good point. He was saying that it's unthinkable to many of us in the West or outside Russia that these things might happen on a fairly regular basis now, and it not to have a massive impact on society up to and including calls for the government to fall or to be toppled. And it kind of comes down to, well, I think they've gone through apathy, and it comes. Francis was saying, and I agree, that it comes from a position of powerlessness. People just feel they are powerless. That stuff is high politics and what have you, and they've never really had a vote in it. They turn out once in a while, and Putin rubber stamps a 98%, ballot. And so if they feel powerless, then there is almost no reason to get worried about this unless it's directly impacting you. And I thought that was quite interesting. It's probably worth a in a moment, Natalia, I'll be interested in your thoughts on whether or not you feel there is this powerless trait running through Russian society now after 20 years of Putin. But the only other thing I was going to say was that I noticed from the news reports this morning. So we were quoting on our live blog, we quoted a Ukrainian woman, Lyudmila Savchuk, 57-year-old teacher whose apartment in northwest Kyiv was smashed up last night. And she said, the blast wave broke all the windows, the entry doors are broken too. We were terribly scared. Then there was another explosion in a couple of seconds, 20 or 30 seconds. We're cleaning everything now. So there's a woman who has been subject to this night after night for a year and a half now. And she does say she's terribly scared. But, I mean, there's a real stoicism in there. We're finishing up, we're cleaning everything now. They're just getting on with it. And I posit that against the footage we see of these strikes in Russia last night, particularly the ones that are reportedly from the military airfield of Pskov. But there is footage you'll find it on social media. People filming this. It's quite some way away, but you can hear them. They are shocked by what they're witnessing, and they're sort of calling out and screaming and shouting. And now I spoke last week or whatever it was the week before about drone strikes, and we had a discussion about where the moral line is about firing at civilian targets or even firing at military targets, in the knowledge that if your projectile is intercepted, it is likely to fall on a civilian area, and therefore civilians could be hurt and killed. And we had a discussion about that. I'm not hard over there, but we had a good chat and got a lot of good feedback of people saying that's what it is, and that's fair enough. And I was reminded of that this morning by looking at Lyudmila Savchuk's reaction, that she said she was terribly scared, but she's getting on with it and cleaning up the glass. And then these people, I presume are Russian citizens, very clearly shocked by what they're seeing at Pskov. Pskov, a very obviously military target. And my overwhelming feeling was good. I thought, I don't want you to be terrorized. I don't want you as a civilian to be killed, hurt, maimed, what have you. I don't want you to be terrorized, but I want you to be scared. I want you to feel something. I want you to say to yourself, this wasn't happening before the special military nonsense all started. Why is that? Can you join the dots? Is it because the Ukrainians are this all-powerful, warmongering, Nazi drug dealer society, or is it because of something that's happening in Moscow and Putin? I was pleased is too, well, it just sounds a bit dark, really, but I wasn't worried for these people, and I didn't empathise with them. I was quietly happy that they were scared. I don't want them to be terrorised, but I want them to be scared by what they're seeing, not what is happening physically to them. Now, and I don't know if that makes me a bad man, but I just felt that this morning when I was looking at these two reactions. But by all means, come back at me on that, Natalia, or anybody. But I'd be really interested in your ideas about the powerlessness of Russian society.
Yeah, Dom, I know where you're coming from in terms of seeing the reaction of Russians. Obviously, that reaction is there, and like however apathetic you are, you would react like that if you saw something as horrific. And about powerlessness, I mean, yes, absolutely, and it's not something that just started 2 years ago. The Putin regime has been pushing away the Russian society to the margins for years. I mean, if you looked back 10 years ago, it was like, yes, you're allowed to come out with a political protest as long as you get an official permit. Later on, it would be something like it would be very difficult to get a permit. So if you rally without one, you would be very much likely beaten and maybe detained, spend 10 days in jail. After that, all of those protests were essentially barred. Apparently, technically in Moscow, they still have those COVID restrictions. I mean, there are no COVID restrictions anywhere else, but apparently when someone recently tried to apply for a permission to rally, they were told that the COVID restrictions are in place. What I'm trying to say is that the government has been trying to disempower the citizens for so many years, starting with protests and elections, and basically showing them that whatever you do, there's nothing that you can do. I can look back to the massive wave of anti-Putin protests from 2011, 2012, where people came out in such large numbers that it felt that, a victory is very close, or at least the government is going to make some concession. And it didn't. And because it kept happening for years and years, and the screws were being tightened further and further, that tolerance for pain, the tolerance for repressions, of course grew. And that's why, we ended up where we are. At some point, people were terrified and shocked when Putin ordered troops into Ukraine. And now, 18 months later, a drone attack on a residential building in Moscow doesn't shock everyone. That's about it. And again, I totally understand what you say about thinking that those Russians in the regions, maybe they will feel the pain and they will see the light. But right now, it doesn't look like whatever is happening is changing the minds of the vast majority of people. I'm not talking about the opposition-minded minority or the minority of warmongers like Igor Girkin and his supporters. I'm talking about in between 60% of the population. So far, they're unmoved, and I don't see how they're going to be moved anytime soon.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia Vassilieva, for that, and Dom, for your question there. Francis, can I come back to you? At the beginning of your section today, you spoke about the British Foreign Secretary's journey to China and why this is so important and what it shows us about foreign policy and Britain's sort of wishes in the world for the next few years. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and just put the Ukraine war in that context?
Well, thanks, David. That was a fascinating discussion. Yes, James Cleverly is the first British Foreign Secretary to visit China in half a decade today, and has insisted that not engaging with China would be a show of weakness. And this is an important moment, I think, in terms of Britain trying to grapple with this question about how to deal with China, for the next year, the next 5 years, and possibly even the next decade. Although, of course, if a new government were to come in, which many of the pollsters believe is likely within the next year or so, then there may well be a shift in approach. But this is still a significant moment in the context of the war in Ukraine, as you say. It will lay the ground for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's meeting with Xi, which is being sought for the G20 summit in India next month. But it has exposed splits within the British establishment, really, but certainly within the governing Conservative Party, about how to strike a balance between engaging with as well as standing up to China. And the Telegraph understands that there are figures around Mr. Sunak's cabinet table who are against Mr. Cleverly's trip, and a senior Whitehall figure also accused the Foreign Secretary of sucking up to the Chinese and questioned the wisdom of the visit. Now, for context here in Britain, a few weeks ago, Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden said China represents the largest state-based threat to Britain's economic security, while stressing that he did not want to decouple from China. There was also a devastating report by the UK's Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, which argued that the UK is severely handicapped by the short-termist approach that has allowed China to penetrate every sector of the UK's economy. They certainly don't mince their words, and I remember covering it at the time. It also accused the British government of failing to develop an effective strategy for dealing with national security threats from China, which it argued has allowed their intelligence to aggressively target the UK, something, of course, experienced by many Western countries and companies, including Microsoft in the US very recently. But Mr. Cleverly has taken critics of his trip head on and defended the diplomatic engagement. He told the Financial Times that, and I quote, "to consciously withdraw and not utilise our standing in the world, the authority and voice that we have, that would be seen not as a sign of strength." In essence, he argues that China is too big to ignore, although in doing so, he has appeared to dismiss the approach of Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister who first appointed him as Foreign Secretary and who wanted to designate China as a threat in a reworked foreign policy and diplomatic strategy document. Now, regular listeners will recall that in a significant speech back in April, Mr. Cleverly laid out his nuanced approach to China, built around three pillars. First, to protect national security whenever Beijing poses a threat to UK people or posterity. Second, to align cooperation with friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific and across the world to uphold international law. And third, to engage directly with China to promote stable relations. Evidently, it is this third pillar which is the core priority of this visit. We understand that he will discuss Hong Kong, the climate crisis, and the war in Ukraine. But progress, and this is important, is being made on the second, albeit very much in the background. And I think that's something that's going on in the background in many Western countries at the moment, regardless of what they're saying publicly with regard to China. And that is that Britain has seen its foreign policy interests, like the US, like many other countries, focus particularly on the Indo-Pacific within the past couple of years. And a new report was published only today by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee here in Britain, calling for even stronger ties to be forged in that region as the global geopolitical and economic centre of gravity moves eastward, evidently designed fundamentally to bolster democratic interests in that region. But nonetheless, all of that said, James Cleverly is adopting, I think, what many would call is a realist approach to China. And that is one favoured by, of course, perhaps the most well-known realist in the world, Henry Kissinger, who recently gave an extensive interview to The Economist where he expressed his concern at a possible future confrontation between the US and China. Kissinger said that he thinks both sides have convinced themselves that the other represents a strategic danger, and said he was particularly alarmed by the competition between the two to gain technological and economic superiority, especially when fueled by artificial intelligence. To quote him, "We're in the classic pre-World War I situation where neither side has much margin of political concession and in which any disturbance of the equilibrium can lead to catastrophic consequences." Ideally, he argues, therefore, and as I say, this is one that is adopted, or a stance of being adopted by many Western leaders at the moment, is to build a new approach based on kind of shared values when shared values can be found, so ones that both the West and the China can endorse. He says that the West misunderstands China's ambitions, and for him, it is not heading for world domination in a Hitlerian sense, that he says that they're not trying to create a new world order. He believes that war was inevitable for Nazi Germany because Hitler needed it, something, as I've spoken about in the past, endorsed by Adam Tooze in his excellent book, Wages of Destruction, which argues that the Nazi state and the economy could only survive through conquest, something that Kissinger and others argue is not the case for China. I assume that he also means that China is not able to export its values globally. One cannot import Chinese hyper-nationalist brand of communism to Britain or elsewhere, for instance, which is different to the perceived threat, of course, during the Cold War posed by the Soviet Union, which sought global revolution by offering a malleable internationalist ideology. So, in essence, we have two approaches. One that seeks to gradually decouple from China, seeing it as a global threat, and the other, adopted perhaps by more of the cleverly, the Kissinger approach of seeking to work with China where possible, maintaining dialogue, and more sceptical of the threat posed by its values and ambitions. I would argue that regardless of which position one holds, what is true surely for both is that one requires leverage over China. And one of the reasons I think that Cleverly is coming under such extensive criticism is that it is not clear what he is willing to threaten China with in these talks. I know I've said this before, and I bang this drum a lot, but Theodore Roosevelt was surely right when he said that the important thing in diplomacy is to speak softly and carry a big stick. But where is the stick with regard to Britain's handling of China and arguably the West's handling of China? It simply isn't clear. In which case, one is effectively saying to China, don't do this, we think that's wrong. And when they say, or what, one has no clear response. And until this core issue is addressed, I think Western political figures will continue to be criticised. It's all well and good offering a nuanced approach to China. But if all that really means in practice is raising human rights abuses whilst maintaining investment and strong economic ties, then it leaves them very much open to criticism, especially if relations do continue to deteriorate due to China's explicit support of Russia and its obvious ambitions over Taiwan.
Well, thank you very much for that briefing, Francis. I think it'll be very interesting to see how Cleverly talks about the Ukraine war in his meetings with Chinese officials. So do come back tomorrow and just update us on that, because I think you've given us the sort of briefing ahead of time, and we're going to see how the issues play out in real time over the next few days. So thank you, Francis. I believe with one eye on the clock, we're at the end of our time together now. So can I just move to your final thoughts? Dom Nichols, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll just return to the drone strikes last night, and particularly the ones in the Russian airfield of Pskov up by Estonia. I think it is worth noting this and dwelling just for a moment. I've said before many times that I don't think the Russian armed forces is a learning organisation. Now, some people have said no, they have shown signs of being able to learn and adapt, and I accept that there are certain elements on the ground, but I think they're very, very tactical. And we're not seeing anything now. They've withdrawn to a fixed defence, so they've had months to prepare. There is no sign of an operational level breakthrough up in the northeast or around Bakhmut or anywhere else. So they might have learned how to defend even better than they could already, but I don't see a huge amount. And then let's look at Pskov last night. What on earth were the air defence doing? Well, they clearly weren't doing anything. Now, to lose 4 IL-76s, that's a biggie. Okay, those are not easily replaced. I don't know how many there are in the Russian fleet, but there'll be a couple of dozen, 30, 40, something like that. I doubt it's that high. I can't imagine it's more than 30 odd. You'll know better than me out there. Please let me know. So, 4 is significant. So either the air defence and more broadly the system, the Russian armed forces, are not learning. They're not looking at what's going on. They're not looking at the strike that wiped out Tupolev Tu-22M a few weeks ago. They're not learning from this, or they're not able to. They're not able to do anything about it. They might be prioritising the air defence assets they have for the front lines in Ukraine. Now that that is probably a good thing as far as Ukraine are concerned. So, but if they're either not learning or they've not got the stuff there because they've had to send it into Ukraine, I think that will encourage Ukraine to continue to target military sites, keeping them well away from that moral argument that we had last week that I mentioned briefly earlier on about what do you target if you're in an existentialist fight for your life, which is a definition of existentialist. Don't sneer, Francis. But, it does allow Ukraine room to plan, because if you know what your enemy is going to do, if you know what their dispositions are, and you can assess to a degree of certainty, or, you feel confident in your assessment that you know what they're going to do, i.e. Russia, they're not going to do anything on air defence, or they don't have the assets, that means you can plan long term. And that is only ever good for a military side, to be able to do that with some degree of certainty about what the other side is going to do. I look at these paper drones, these cardboard drones, which I presume are getting through because either because the air defence isn't there or because they have such a low radar cross-section. And if anybody knows anything about cardboard drones and radar cross-sections, please email me this afternoon, because I've got to write 500 words in the next 2 hours. But I think it comes down to the fact that Russia is not overall a learning organisation. The system, the military system in particular, is not a learning organisation. They are just doing what they know, or what they can. Either of those, I think Zelensky would take. And I'm reminded yet again, and I've said it before, no great insight here, the great Napoleon quote about never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake. And I think that's what Ukraine are pressing at now when it comes to these long-range strikes inside Russia.
Thank you very much, Dom. Natalia Vassilieva.
Yeah, I really would like to just add a couple of words to what Dom just said. Obviously, yes, the attack on Pskov should have quite a significant damage, and it would be very interesting to see if we can see the immediate impact on the ground in the coming days or weeks. Again, like Pskov is one of the places where one of Russia's most battle-ready paratrooper unit is based, the Pskov division, and the airfield was used by them, and these are the planes that Pskov paratroopers would be using to go to Ukraine. So obviously, the more of those attacks we have that impact that directly impacts the battle readiness, it would be very interesting to see what happens on the ground. Like, are we going to be seeing troops arriving later than they should be, that the reinforcements will not be coming in as on the schedule that would be appropriate? So yeah, it's quite fascinating. I'm quite interested to see the immediate impact of that in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Dom and Natalia. Francis Sternley, would you like the final words?
Well, thank you, David. Lots of abstractions and theories from me today. So I just wanted to return to the human cost of this war in my final thought. And it's been a while since we've spoken about children on the podcast. And Ukrainian authorities today ordered the mandatory forced evacuation of children from 5 towns near the southern Zaporizhzhia front line as fighting in the region intensifies in the way that Don was describing earlier and we were talking about yesterday. The head of the regional military administration has said that 54 children and 64 accompanying family members were being forced to evacuate from one settlement in the region. And he just gave a flavour of quite how vicious it is from a civilian perspective there. He said there are an average of 90 to 120 attacks per day, and there are settlements that are constantly under fire. So just a small, tiny example on one area of the front of what the cost of this war means for children and civilians more broadly. Another development in this space today is that we hear that more than 1,300 schools have been totally destroyed in government-held Ukraine since the invasion last year, UNICEF said today. Others have been seriously damaged. And as we've talked about in the podcast previously, this has massive ramifications, of course, on the education of children. Many of them have had to be learning in bunkers or learning from home with resources that are out of date or without access to up-to-date technology. And I know we've covered that extensively, but nonetheless, this is still all going on in the background. And obviously, we're trying to bring you the most important developments, but it's important, I think, not to forget that this is a generational battle that is being fought here, and one that will take many, many years for Ukraine to recover from in terms of the educational impact on the next generation. And that's before, of course, one even gets into the war crimes, the thousands of stolen children, and those whose lives have been cut cruelly short by this war. We haven't forgotten them, and we will continue to draw attention to their plight whenever we can, and I'm sure we will in the next few days and weeks. Certainly there's no shortage of things going on, but at the moment our attention is elsewhere. But as I say, always worth bearing them in mind as well as this terrible war goes on.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia, Dom and Francis, for your time and your reporting today. To our listeners, thanks so much for tuning in and listening to our reporting day after day. A quick thing from me. The deadline for the British Podcast Awards is fast approaching, and we'd really love it if you'd enter the podcasts for the Listener's Choice Awards. If you'd like to nominate us, just go to www.britishpodcastawards.com/voting and vote for the podcast there. We'll put the web address in the show notes. Thanks again. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Louisa Wells, and the executive producers were David Knowles and Louisa Wells.